The small band of workers in Mary Baker Eddy's household at Pleasant View shared qualities that enabled these ordinary people to measure up to an extraordinary calling. Through the years, in Boston, Concord, and Chestnut Hill, total honesty characterized her helper, secretary, and chief of staff, Calvin Frye.
I can hardly realize that in 1881 there was but one Christian Science church, that it held its services in the parlor of our leader, Mrs. Eddy, in Lynn, Massachusetts, and that my first attendance on that service found seated there in the audience about 18 persons on plain camp stools, the simple service conducted by our revered leader, Mrs. Eddy. Calvin Frye.
As he sat in that parlor on Broad Street in 1881, Calvin Frye was an earnest young man of 35. His character had been molded by a life of rectitude and difficulty. Earlier that year, in the mill town of Lawrence, Massachusetts, life had been grim for Calvin and his family. Calvin and his brother were working as machinists. They had long since given up any thought of higher education. After 1 year of marriage, Calvin's wife had died. His father was disabled, but the greatest distress in the Frye household involved his mother. Lydia Frye was suffering another of the spells of insanity that had committed her to mental hospitals over the years. Then a close relative of the Fryes was healed of a long-standing ailment through the teachings of a woman in nearby Lynn. Remarkable healings through prayer were drawing people to listen to this woman, Mary Glover Eddy, Mary Baker Eddy, as she came to be known. In desperation, the Fryes sought help from one of her students, Clara Choate. Within a matter of weeks, Lydia's sanity was restored. The family were astounded, especially the deeply religious Calvin. He read Mrs. Eddy's book and enrolled at her newly chartered Massachusetts Metaphysical College in Lynn. Mrs. Eddy's husband, Gilbert, noted qualities in this new student that someday might make him a good person to assist with his wife's growing burdens. At this juncture, however, Calvin returned to Lawrence to put into practice what he had learned.
At the turn of the new year, 1882, the Eddys left Lynn. As spring came on, they settled in Boston. By May, they had leased a building on Columbus Avenue as their residence and as a new home for the Massachusetts Metaphysical College. During the next few weeks, Mrs. Eddy renewed her classroom teaching. 1 month later, in the midst of this growing activity, Gilbert died.
In July, she retreated from Boston to the hills of Vermont. At a home belonging to one of her followers, she found comfort and solitude. Slowly, Mrs. Eddy rallied to the mission before her. By the end of the month, she was able to announce to them, "Hold the fort, for I am coming."
Before she left Vermont, she sent a telegram to Calvin Frye. It asked him to meet her train and join her on the way back to Boston. Calvin came immediately and never left, staying on for 28 years through thick and thin. There would be plenty of both. He was a man of few words. His memos were famous for their brevity. Yankee to the core, he kept his feelings to himself, but they ran deep. Even years after her passing, in the middle of recalling for someone Mrs. Eddy's early hardships and suffering, Calvin stopped short and burst into tears.
He had a reputation for crustiness, but there was another side to Calvin. He had a dry sense of humor, which Mrs. Eddy enjoyed. He also had musical talents, which entertained her and others in the household. His talents were not secretarial. Calvin had to learn typing and shorthand to keep up with Mrs. Eddy's dictating of letters, articles, and entire works. Years later, Calvin recalled that most of the booklet, Unity of Good, was dictated between the hours of 4 and 6 on cold winter mornings when he had to wrap a comforter around himself to keep warm.
At 1, regular as clockwork, Salkow would be at the carriage port to hold the horses as she stepped into her carriage. Sometimes she would first come around to pat the horses' heads and talk to them. One day on the road, the horses had bolted and galloped off, with Mrs. Eddy leaning out of the window, calling to the horses to quiet them. A year later, the carriage was being driven by a new coachman, Joseph Mann's brother, August, accompanied almost always by Calvin Frye.
Prior to the runaway, Mr. Frye had not accompanied Mrs. Eddy on her daily drive. But after that happened, he never let her go out alone again. Minnie Wygant.
After her drive, Calvin Frye would sort the afternoon mail. He or one of the secretaries would bring the mail to her desk unless she had appointments with church officers, advisors, journalists, or others. Most evenings she spent the hours from 7 to 9 in the swing in the little room over the carriage port, savoring the peace and quiet of her own thoughts, or enjoying a little company. Even enjoying the twilight, she counted the minutes. A little clock sat beside her, the face lit by a small battery-powered lamp so she could watch the time. The bare bulb shined in her eyes, so Calvin, the former machinist, made her a small metal shade using a key ring as a base.
When I returned from supper, I often found Mr. Frye chatting with her about events or news of the day.
Calvin, like the others, came in for sharp correction and reprimand, as she sought to pull him up to her level of thought, as John Salkow put it. Adelaide Still tells us Calvin did not always see the reasons for Mrs. Eddy's decisions. Sometimes he would argue his own point of view, but in the end, he would always obey to the letter.
She would say, "Calvin, you do as I tell you." And he did. Adelaide Still.
April 4, 1902. Mrs. Eddy said today, "When Mr. Frye is himself, he can accomplish the work of 50 men in mental practice, but he is liable the very day to be off again." Calvin Frye.
Yet Mrs. Eddy also said of him, "Calvin is invaluable to me in my work because he would not break one of the 10 Commandments."
For years, it had been Calvin who took dictation and typed the drafts, sorted the mail, sharpened the pencils, kept the books, banked the furnace, rode on the carriage box, and kept the watches in the night and in the day.
Mr. Frye was so busy he did not have time to go to the barber shop, and August Mann had to act as barber for him. I took a picture of this operation one morning, which I still have. Minnie Wygant.
Calvin carried a heavy burden, managing the household and trying to balance Mrs. Eddy's human needs with her directives as discoverer, founder, and leader. Adelaide observed that no one else was so continually on duty, subject to call day or night. She never heard of his having a vacation. Calvin's bedroom was his office. John Salkow noted that Calvin's bed lay beside the wall adjoining Mrs. Eddy's bedroom. Should he be needed, whatever the hour, he would be close at hand.
By his bedside, 2 holes were worn in the carpet right through to the floor, a silent witness to the many long vigils in the night when Calvin Frye, instead of retiring, had sat on the side of his bed, alert and ready for his leader's slightest call. John Salkow.
Sometimes crusty and curt, Calvin was not popular with everyone. But Mrs. Eddy's gifts and remembrances to him, her praise, even her reproofs, show what she thought of her constant helper.
March 30, 1902. Mrs. Eddy told me today that I have done more for Christian Science than any other person on earth except herself. Calvin Frye.
"He has stood by my side to help our cause 21 years, she once said of Calvin. He has done more practical work in my behalf than any other student."